they laughed at her hands first. That's the part nobody talks about when they tell this story. Not the way the room went quiet, not the moment the numbers came back, not even what happened to the man who thought he could humiliate her in front of 40 people. No. The thing people always skip is the hands. Miriam Cordy had the hands of someone who had built things. Not in a poetic way. In a literal way. Her knuckles were thick. Her palms were calloused across the base of the fingers from years of actual physical work before she ever touched a spreadsheet. When she walked into the conference room on the 14th floor of Hargrove Capital Partners that Tuesday morning in March, she was wearing a navy blazer she'd owned for 11 years and a pair of shoes that were clean but not new. And the first thing Dale Rutherford did. Dale Rutherford, the managing partner, the man whose name was on the glass at the front of the building, was glance down at her hands when she set her folder on the table and make a face. Just a small one. The kind of face men like that make when they think they already know what they're looking at. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. If you've ever walked into a room and felt the temperature change the second you came through the door. Not because of anything you said. Not because of anything you did. Just because of who you are and what they decided about you before you opened your mouth. Then you already understand what Miriam felt standing at that table. And if you haven't, just keep watching. Because what happened next is something you are not going to forget. Miriam had driven 4 hours to get to that meeting. She'd left her house in Anniston, Alabama at 4:30 in the morning, stopped once for coffee at a gas station outside Talladega, and arrived in Birmingham 40 minutes early because she did not trust the parking situation near downtown, and she refused to walk in late. She sat in her car in a garage on 5th Avenue North and reviewed her notes by the light of her phone screen until 8:15. Then she walked the 3 blocks to the Hargrove building, took the elevator to 14, gave her name to the receptionist, and waited. She waited for 31 minutes past her scheduled appointment time. Nobody apologized for that. The receptionist, a young woman with a headset and a tight smile, offered her water twice. Miriam declined both times. She sat with her folder in her lap and her back straight, and she watched the activity on the floor through the glass partition. And she did not check her phone because she did not want anyone who walked past to think she was nervous or impatient or anything other than exactly where she was supposed to be. At 8:51, a man named Conrad Pelham came out to get her. Conrad was the junior analyst who had originally reached out to her 6 weeks ago. He was 32, Stanford MBA, good handshake, the kind of practiced warmth that came from a certain kind of upbringing. He'd been professional in all their emails, prompt, courteous. But when he came out to the waiting room and saw Miriam sitting there in her navy blazer with her folder in her lap, something shifted in his face. It was quick. He covered it. "Mrs. Cordy, thank you for coming in." "It's Dr. Cordy," she said. Not loudly, not with any edge. Just as a matter of fact, the way you'd correct someone who mispronounced a street name. Conrad said of course. He was so sorry, and walked her back to the conference room. There were 7 people already seated when she came in. She recognized 3 of them from her research. Dale Rutherford at the head of the table, which she expected. Margot Svensson, the head of portfolio risk, on the left. Miriam had read 2 papers Svensson published in 2019. A man she didn't recognize immediately, heavyset, silver watch, sitting with his arms crossed in the way that meant he had already decided something. And then 4 others arranged down the sides of the table with laptops and legal pads, and the particular alert stillness of people who had been told this meeting was important. Dale Rutherford did not stand up. He looked at her over his glasses and said, "Dr. Cordy, Dale Rutherford." He said his own name the way people say it, when they expect you to react to it. "Sit wherever you like." Miriam chose the seat directly across from him. She set her folder on the table, and that was when he looked at her hands and made the face and didn't say anything. She sat down, opened her folder, and said, "Thank you for having me. I know your time is valuable, so I'd like to get right into it if that's all right." Rutherford leaned back in his chair. "Go ahead. Here's what you need to understand about Miriam Cordy before this goes any further. She was 53 years old. She had grown up in Gadsden, Alabama, third of 5 children. Daughter of a man who worked at Goodyear for 31 years, and a woman who cleaned offices for a medical complex downtown. She had worked her first job at 14, not for pocket money, but because the family needed it. She had gotten a full academic scholarship to Tuskegee, finished her undergraduate degree in 3 years, gone straight into a doctoral program in applied mathematics at Georgia Tech, and written a dissertation on volatility modeling in thin equity markets that her advisor called. And this is a direct quote that Miriam kept on a notacard in her desk drawer at home. The most practically rigorous work I have reviewed in 20 years of sitting on doctoral committees. She had spent the next 2 decades doing what people who look like her and come from where she came from almost never get to do. She had built things. Quietly. Without a famous last name or a famous school or a famous firm behind her. She had started a small independent research consultancy out of a second bedroom in her house in Anniston. She had 3 clients in year 1. She had 22 by year 5. She had built, over the course of 17 years, a track record in distressed asset analysis that was, by any objective measure, extraordinary. Her average return on restructuring recommendations over the prior decade was 31.4%. Not one of her major calls had been wrong in the last 6 years. Nobody at Hargrove Capital Partners knew any of this when Conrad Pelham first emailed her. He had found her through a footnote, literally. There was a paper published in a Journal of Finance special issue, and in a footnote on page 18, another analyst had cited a Miriam O'Cordy brief from 2021 as the earliest documented identification of a structural weakness that later triggered a 9-figure loss at a mid-market private equity firm. Conrad had tracked that brief down, read it, read 3 more, and contacted her on a Thursday afternoon, saying his firm would like to discuss a consulting arrangement. Miriam had done her research before she replied. She took 4 days. She read everything publicly available on Hargrove. She formed her opinion of Dale Rutherford from interviews and a 2022 profile in an industry publication, and her opinion was that he was very good at raising money and not particularly interested in being told things he didn't already believe. She knew walking in that this was the kind of firm where a woman from Anniston, Alabama, with calloused hands and an 11-year-old blazer was going to have to prove something before anyone in that room would actually hear her. She had prepared for exactly that. She started with the overview. Clean, fast, no preamble. She laid out the 3 positions in their portfolio that she believed carried significantly more downside risk than their current models suggested. She showed her methodology. She explained her assumptions. She walked them through the numbers at a pace that assumed everyone in the room was competent enough to follow, which was a form of respect she extended automatically, regardless of whether it was returned. For the first 6 minutes, the room was quiet in the way. Rooms are quiet when people are processing. Then the man with the silver watch, whose name she later learned was Harris Blenfield, a board advisor who had been at Goldman in the 90s, said, "Where did you go to school? Not, what's your source data? Not, how did you model the correlation? Not, can you walk us through your confidence interval? Where did you go to school?" Miriam looked at him for 1 full second before she answered. "Georgia Tech," she said. "Doctoral program in applied mathematics. But I don't think that's actually what you're asking." The temperature in the room changed. Blenfield's eyebrows went up, not angrily. More like someone who had just been handed something unexpected and wasn't sure yet what it was. "I think," Miriam continued, her voice absolutely level, "you're asking whether my numbers are real, which is a fair question. So let me show you." She reached into her folder and produced a single sheet of paper. She slid it across to Margot Svensson, who was closest. It was a comparison document. 12 of her prior recommendations laid against actual outcomes, with dates, with percentage calls, with the variance between her projection and the realized result. Svensson looked at it for 10 seconds. Then she looked up at Miriam. Then she looked back at the sheet. "Can I keep this?" she said. "That copy is yours," Miriam said. "Now, if this were a different kind of story, that would be the moment." Svensson sees the numbers. Everyone leans in. Rutherford takes off his glasses and says he owes her an apology. Credits roll. But that's not what happened. Because this is real life. And in real life, the people who need to change their minds the most are usually the last ones to do it. Rutherford cleared his throat. These are projections, he said. We're a firm that deals in a lot of projections. Miriam nodded. Yes, the question for us isn't whether your historical calls were good. The question is whether your model applies to our specific positions, which have characteristics I'm not sure your methodology accounts for. He said it in the particular tone of someone who believes they are being incisive. The people around him, most of them, settled back slightly, the way people do when they expect the thing they've been waiting for to happen. Miriam looked at him directly. Which characteristics? She said. A pause. I'm sorry? You said my methodology might not account for certain characteristics of your positions. I'd like to know which ones specifically. That way I can either show you that I have accounted for them or acknowledge the gap. Either one would be useful. Rutherford opened his mouth, closed it. He looked down at the papers in front of him, in the way people look at papers when they're buying themselves time. And the room watched him do it. All 7 people at that table watched Dale Rutherford, whose name was on the building, try to come up with a specific objection and not be able to find one. Harris Blenfield, to his left, shifted in his chair. Margot Svensson set down the comparison sheet and picked up her pen. This is the part that matters. Not the silence itself, but what was in it. Because here is what everyone in that room understood in that moment. Miriam O.C. Cordy had not come to Birmingham to impress them. She had not driven 4 hours and waited 31 minutes and sat through a question about her educational credentials because she needed their approval. She was there because she had identified something real, and she believed they needed to know it, and if they weren't going to hear it, that was going to be their problem, and not hers. The man who had looked at her hands like they didn't belong on his conference table was now unable to produce a single specific objection to her work, and everyone in that room could see it. It was Conrad Pelham, actually, who broke the silence. The junior analyst, the 32-year-old with the Stanford MBA and the practiced warmth. He said quietly, without looking up from his notepad, I think we should go through position 2 in detail. It was the smallest possible intervention. It was also the right one. Miriam turned to the second section of her analysis. What followed was 40 minutes of the most substantive conversation Miriam had been in since her doctoral defense. Not because the people in the room were suddenly transformed into different people. Rutherford stayed guarded for the first 15 minutes. Blenfield stayed quiet. But Svensson engaged. And when Svensson engaged, 2 of the junior analysts followed. And once actual questions were flowing. Real questions, technical questions, questions about the data and the model and the underlying assumptions. The dynamic shifted in the way it always shifts when the work is allowed to speak for itself. Miriam answered every question directly. She acknowledged 2 places where her model carried uncertainty and explained how she'd tried to bound it. She pushed back once, firmly, when one of the analysts suggested an alternative interpretation that she thought was structurally flawed, and she explained why without softening it. She asked Svensson one question of her own about how the firm's risk committee was currently thinking about sector concentration, and the answer Svensson gave her confirmed something she'd suspected. By the end, there were 12 pages of handwritten notes spread across 3 different legal pads. Rutherford had not apologized. But he had, somewhere around the 40-minute mark, stopped looking at the table when she spoke and started looking at her face. Which is not nothing. Which is, in fact, the beginning of something. The meeting ended at 11:17. Conrad walked her to the elevator. In the hallway, away from the conference room, he said, I want to apologize for some of what happened in there. You don't need to apologize for other people, Miriam said. I know. But I should have, Conrad. She said his name with the same evenness she'd used all morning. You found my work in a footnote, and you read it carefully enough to understand what you were looking at. That's more than most people do. You don't owe me anything. He nodded. He pressed the elevator button. He said, We're going to want to talk next steps. Send me something in writing, she said. I'll review it. The elevator opened. She stepped in. She turned around and faced forward, and the doors closed, and she rode down to the lobby alone. She walked through the lobby without stopping, through the glass doors, out onto Fifth Avenue North, and into the mid-morning Birmingham air. She walked to the end of the block, and then she stood at the corner for a moment, with her folder under her arm and the sun on her face, and she let out a long, slow breath. She had known, walking in, that she would have to prove herself. She had known it, and she had prepared for it, and she had walked into that room anyway, and she had done what she came to do. But knowing something ahead of time does not make it easy when you're in it. It doesn't make the look at the hands not sting. It doesn't make the 31 minutes not feel like what they were. It doesn't make any of it not cost something. She stood at the corner for about 30 seconds. Then she put on her sunglasses, walked back to the parking garage, and started the 4-hour drive home to Anniston. 3 weeks later, Hargrove Capital Partners retained Miriam on a consulting basis. The terms she negotiated were, according to Conrad, who seemed genuinely startled when she sent back her revised draft, significantly above what we typically offer for initial engagements. She had anticipated they would open low. She had prepared for that too. 4 months after she began work, one of the 3 positions she had flagged in that conference room produced exactly the kind of structural loss she had modeled. Not the full downside. The firm had partially de-risked after her recommendation, but enough that the risk committee convened a special review to assess what the loss would have looked like without her intervention. The number they arrived at was substantial, the kind of number that has several commas in it. Margot Svensson sent Miriam an email that afternoon. It was 3 sentences. The last sentence was, "I want you to know I passed your name to 2 colleagues at other firms this morning, and I told them not to make the same mistake we almost made." Miriam read that email at her kitchen table in Anniston with her second cup of coffee. She read it twice. Then she closed her laptop and went out to her backyard and looked at the garden her mother had planted along the back fence 30 years ago, the one Miriam had been tending since her mother passed, and she stood there in the quiet for a while. Her mother had cleaned offices for 32 years. She had worked the early shift so she could be home when the kids got back from school. She had pressed her uniforms the night before and kept them on a separate hanger so they wouldn't touch anything else. She had done all of it without once performing gratitude for people who thought they were doing her a favor by employing her. Miriam had learned more from watching that than she had ever learned in any classroom. There is a detail from that morning in the conference room that Miriam has mentioned exactly once, in a conversation with her youngest sister about 2 months after the meeting. When Rutherford looked at her hands and made that face, Miriam noticed it. Of course she noticed. She notices everything. But what she did with that noticing was this. She set it aside, the way you set aside something you know you're going to come back to, and she focused on the work. She focused on the numbers and the methodology and the argument she had built over months of careful analysis. She let the work be the thing in the room that demanded attention. She told her sister, "The work has to be so good they can't look away from it. That's the only answer to the look. You make the work so undeniable that they have no choice but to see it." Her sister said, "That's exhausting. You shouldn't have to do that." Miriam said, "No, you're right, I shouldn't." And then she said, "But until the world is different, the work is what we have." If this story reached you, if you felt something sitting with Miriam in that waiting room, or in that conference room, or in that conference room, or standing on that corner in the Birmingham sun, drop something in the comments. Tell me if you've been in a room like that. Tell me what you did with the weight of it. Because I think more people know exactly what that feels like than will ever admit it out loud. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about people who were underestimated and outlasted, people who did the work when the work was the only option they had, hit that subscribe button. There are more of these. There will always be more of these. Miriam still lives in Anniston. She still has the same calendar she's used for 15 years, the paper kind, the one she fills in with a blue pen. Her name is on more than 24 papers and briefs now, and she does not have a publicist or a social media account or a podcast. She has her work and her garden, and the memory of her mother pressing a uniform on a hanger the night before, and that has turned out to be more than enough.